Welcome to Chicago Style Parenting, where we delve into parenting life in Chicago and uncover the resources, information, and support that Chicago families need.
I'm Satara.
And I'm Amy. We are excited to chat with today's guest as we explore an interesting, worrisome, impactful tool that is both on the horizon and already here.
That's right. Today we'll be discussing how to prepare our kids for the age of AI. Our guest today is Martin Moran, lead designer of middle and upper school at Bennett Day School. Martin has presented at numerous conferences, sits on the board of South by Southwest EDU, and was recognized by the National Association of Independent Schools as a teacher of the future.
Oh, thanks, Tara. So I'm Martin Moran, and you said it all. That's my role. I have been working at Bennett Day School now for 7 years. I opened the high school. I designed and opened the high school as the in 2019 as the director, and I've kind of moved now more into a leadership and design function in the school where I make sure that we're trying to think about how to best design our program for kids as they go through this. So this is a topic that certainly that ties into things I think about pretty much every day, and oftentimes when I'm awake at night and trying to figure out what comes next, that's where we go.
In the last couple of years, schools have been scrambling to create policies, implement bans, or find ways to integrate AI technology into the curriculum. What are you doing at Bennett Day School?
So first of all, thanks for having me on. It's great to talk about this topic. I'm really excited to talk about this really essential element of what's coming next in terms of both the world and education. I think when it comes to AI, one of the biggest challenges right now is just how little we actually know about it. And so as a school, when we're trying to plan for it, schools love to plan, but oftentimes with technology, planning is the last thing you can really think about doing because it's going to change in 6 months. So what we're really trying to do is trying to think about how can we get into a position where we can understand that this is going to be a big part of our students' lives. It's going to be a big part of their lives as 11-year-olds, as 18-year-olds, but again, as potentially 35, 40, 45-year-olds. So how do we get in front of this in such a way where we can set their mindset around how to use a tool like this to effectively pursue the type of learning that they want to do and not let it sort of run the show, so to speak. In other words, how can the student be in control of the technology, not the technology be in control of the student? And so when it comes to sort of initial responses, it's not really about any one single policy, whether it's, you have to have some sort of citation or things like that. It's not necessarily about any one given thing. It's about how do you approach the entirety of the process. In other words, how do you work with students on how to understand the limitations of, for example, ChatGPT 4.0? How do you understand what it can do? And then understand that when you're using it, you need to understand how the interface between yourself as a human being and the technology works. Because otherwise, if you're not understanding that sort of unique interface between how you affect the technology and the technology affects you, then what's going to happen is students are going to start using it in such a way that really is a detriment to them long term.
Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit more about why Bennett Day School is not particularly worried about AI?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest challenges facing schools in general is that AI, especially when it comes to large language models and things like GPT or Gemini or things like that, what they're very, very good at is modeling the type of responses that are kind of almost like reactionary responses. In other words, feed a prompt, get a response, feed a prompt, get a response. And when schools are asking those types of questions of students, unfortunately, what's happening is that these AI and large language models are really good at mimicking that. So when you're a school that is built around that type of learning, I would be very nervous about what's coming next, because the question is, well, how am I going to know what the difference is? How am I going to know what is a call and response from a GPT model and what's a response from a student? Why Bennett isn't really worried about it is because really the bulk of what we focus on is the idea of creative problem solving, critical thinking, things like that, where it's a lot harder to mimic that with the GPT or the AI model. And so, like, if you look at, for example, the AP scores, I don't know if you've seen this, that like in the last 2 years, ChatGPT has aced almost every AP test. It basically it takes the test and it just aces it. But the only one that it struggles with is the English language and composition one, which it was literature and composition one, because the literature and composition AP tests asks you to take multiple pieces of data, understand them, analyze them, compare them, think about them critically, and create solutions based on that. And GPT 3.5 especially had real trouble being able to do that. So whereas it can just match the typical AP call and response test, it has a really hard time focusing in on how do you analyze, synthesize, and understand information and put it together. And that's where we focus the entirety of our program. So whereas, yeah, it's going to affect us, it's not going to be that kind of knife in the heart of our program, because that's not really what we focus on.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's the AP. It's master the LSAT. It's like any type of standardized test. GPT has basically gotten to a point already where it gets perfect scores.
What about questions that are based on like personal experience? Like, tell us about a time in your life where you had to, like, I remember those sort of questions on, AP test or just like accelerated course test. And how does AI answer personal questions like that?
I mean, so AI really is only as good as the inputs, right? So what it's going to do is it's going to look at a question like that and say, well, based on the 10 million responses I've seen online, here's what a typical personal experience might look like in this scenario. And so it will create something based on that. So while, at a cursory glance, it probably won't look terribly different than a human being, but all it will take is a little bit of digging into it to say, oh, okay, this seems a little bit rote. This seems a little bit boilerplate. And so I think one of the things when you ask the question about Bennett and why we're not too worried is that when that type of question would be the perfect type of question where our teachers would be like, all right, I know you, Satara, as a student. That doesn't sound like you. I know your experience. I know you well enough to know that this doesn't feel like something that's true to who you are. And I think this is where I think schools need to live. They need to live in that place where they know kids so well that when a student submits something like that, it becomes what do I really, if I don't know the student well enough, well, maybe I won't notice the difference. But if I know this student and I have a relationship with a student and I can figure out how to connect their work to who they are, I can look at that and be like, this doesn't sound like you. Tell me more about this. And I think that's the other big difference, I think, between what schools will be doing hopefully in the future as this stuff becomes more prevalent and where it is now. I think we're going to have to. I don't think there is any question about it. We're going to have to prioritize relationships as a system, because that's the only way that we can provide the type of personalized feedback that learning really is built on.
Yeah. So as a teacher, what do you think is a valuable use of AI then? Or could you dive into that a little deeper for us?
Yeah. I think there are plenty of places to do it. Right now, I'd say there are fewer places on the student side that I would necessarily be like, that's the greatest thing to do. I would actually say student use of it, we're still teaching them how to use it effectively. I would say, to be honest, where I find it the most valuable is a couple places. One of which is, as a teacher, you're able to, first and foremost, when you are, I taught, it's funny, I teach a media studies class, which is like, we study the history of the way in which, or not just the history, but the history and sociology of how we interact with things like television and the internet and things like that. So like, this is where I've been doing this for like 20 years. So one of the things though, when I'm creating my syllabi, is that as a teacher, you have a certain amount of time to really live your life. So I'm like, I'll have to ask GPT, for example, can you give me the list of what are the 5 books on this topic this year that have been the most cited? so like things like that I need this information pretty quickly, and I have a certain level of expertise in the subject going into it, so I can know what questions to ask. But that type of piece where I can say, oh, that's great, now I can get that. Can you tell me which of those touches on Marshall McLuhan? And it'll give me, and it'll pull that for me. And so it's almost as if like a personal assistant. It's almost the idea that this is something that can get me the type of information that might have taken me half an hour, 45 minutes, an hour in previous years to look at and kind of do Google searches on, whereas I can now ask this and pull that together. And so, so that's probably like, in terms of assisting teachers as they try to keep current, is a really, I think, valuable use of this, because it does pull a lot of the more, I mean, obviously there's a limit. Sometimes it's not to the minute, but I'm looking for stuff in the last couple of years that's been talked about in this topic. I can pull that up. That's probably the primary way in which, and on my teaching, that I've been using it to kind of just keep me current in those types of ways. But the other piece is on the assessment side. I think, so Bennett is a competency-based school, which means instead of grades, we do a set of competencies that students have to master. And so each one of those competencies has a set of sub-skills that are listed under the competency. So for example, a competency of writing might be like developing a cogent thesis statement is like a sub-skill under writing, right? Now, what I can do in terms of GPT is I can pull out a piece of student work, for example, and I can look at that and I can say, can you tell me what are you seeing in terms of how the thesis statement is used in this? It's not going to give you the best answer, but it's going to give me something to think about as I'm grading or assessing a student piece of work that will help me sort of have a second set of eyes almost on this paper that can help me do that. So I think it's really nice when you can do that and someone can look at this and say, as long as I'm putting in a very specific set of criteria, please look for the use of transitions between paragraphs. And I'm not asking it to do more than that. And it can tell me this transition is this transition is this. And I can then say, okay, now based on what I'm reading, that's helping me formulate my assessment of it. So I think on the assessment side, it's great. I think it's what I'm excited about, frankly, is that, so like for a school like ours with this competency map, we use it for all students from grades 5 through 12. What we're hoping to do is eventually build our own AI model that will allow students to submit some work and be like, how do you see this in terms of the competency map? So before they turn it into me, they're asking questions and they're self-editing using that same way I just talked about, but they're starting to learn how to do it themselves. So when I was talking earlier about how our job is to teach students how to use it, that's how you teach students how to use it, as opposed to, well, write this paper for me. This is going to be, no, I've written this paper. Tell me what you're seeing so that I can make edits. Okay. And whether it's a student working on it by themselves or it's a parent sitting next to a student that's saying, let's look at this tool map and let's figure out how it fits, it makes the assessment process so much more transparent for kids and families too. So I think that's the type of stuff that gets me excited about the usage of it. But those are probably the two big areas, I would say.
Yeah, I think that's just like the best way for kids to use it, right? Like this is an assist to the work that you're doing. This is not the replacement for the work that you should be doing.
Exactly. I think that's the hard part for kids, for anybody to understand, for that matter. Like I can ask it about I can go to ChatGPT and say, tell me about the most effective swimming strokes to become an Olympian. I have no expertise in swimming. I know nothing. So I'm going to believe whatever it tells me. The same way a student is going to believe whatever it tells them about this topic. But if I'm asking it about how to use a teaching resource, I can look at it and be like, that helps, that doesn't, that helps. So I think you have to have a certain level of pre-existing expertise and knowledge just to use it in the first place. And I think that's where it's important to teach kids how to use it, because they have such little expertise relative to the world that than they will as they grow. And so you want to teach them how to use it so that when they do develop that expertise, they're effectively doing that and not just believing whatever it tells them. I mean, that's always the challenge.
This actually rolls into my next question perfectly. So this was a nice assist to this next question. At what age do you notice students starting to rely on AI to assist them in their coursework? And then At what age do parents need to start thinking about AI as
Hmm.
well?
I think it's likely happening, early, not unlike many sort of subject specific academic pieces. You're really starting to see it in early middle school. You're seeing it, into fifth and sixth grade, sixth and seventh grade. It starts to become more prominent as we start to ask kids to do more large form writing, as we ask them to do more large form anything. You start to see it there, and I think that's an important thing to note, because the other piece that we know about that era in a student's life, in the developmental stage of student's life, is that that's also where the social and emotional world gets thrown into upheaval. So we know that it's a challenging time no matter what. So I
Yeah.
think, when parents are thinking about this, when you're thinking about your child in fifth and sixth grade, maybe who's sort of on the cusp of adolescence, that's a time when those types of conversations are probably going to stick the most. As you
Mhm.
start to get into seventh and eighth grade, it becomes harder, because obviously not only are they using it, are they finding use for it more often, but they're also at an age where they're going to be a little more resistant to parental support, or they would call it intrusion. I wouldn't call it intrusion. And so I think thinking about that fifth and sixth grade time period is a good time to start thinking about that, in the same way that we talked maybe 5 or 6 years ago about talking about social media and things like that. It's about that time. I think we need to really think of that, like, time between ages 10 and 12, as really important to lay the groundwork for some of this stuff, and to really set up some norms and expectations, and not just for the sake of expectations, but to help put that kid in a place where they're still going to make mistakes, but they're going to be able to learn from those mistakes in a way that I think will be productive. And I think that's the most important thing. And it's really, I think we, in so many ways, that those few years get neglected in school. It's like, and I think we really want. I would say, obviously, just from a technology standpoint, but also just in general, like, your 10 to 12-year-old, that's just because it's not the time period, like the early childhood program or the high school program, that tends to get all of the focus. That time period is really important to set them up for the next 8, 10, 12, 15 years of their life.
Mhm.
And I think that's what I would say is, just, if you've got a 10-year-old and between a 10, 11, or 12-year-old, have those conversations now. It's a great time to have
Yeah.
them.
Well, speaking of giving kids the opportunities to make mistakes with this, that they can learn from,
Yeah.
what about plagiarism?
Yeah. Yeah.
Is is that something students need to be concerned about in AI use? Is there, I mean, I can't even believe I'm asking this because it seems so crazy, but is there a proper method for citing the use of AI?
Yes, yes. It's interesting. APA has come out with an official citation style for
Oh,
AI. So
wow.
so there
Have
is,
they?
yeah, there's quite literally an APA style citation for AI. The challenge, though, is that whereas, like, when you cite a book, I, as a teacher, could go and look at that book. I can't recreate the chat that you had with AI, so you cite it, and I kind of just have to say, okay, at least you've
That's
pointed that
the,
out. So it becomes a
yeah.
real challenge. And so plagiarism can be an issue, because, well, on one hand, um, there's sort of like the blatant plagiarism. I know I've heard stories of teachers getting work that is submitted, that, like, the answer to the question is there, and then below it says, would you like me to answer another question? And it's like, oh, well, this
No,
could just copy the entire thing, like.
no
And then,
way.
yeah, and then you're like, well, I'm just going to bust you because you didn't pay attention to what you're supposed to be doing here. So at least try a little harder if you're going to try to plagiarize. um, but um, but I think what it's important to talk about with students is that it's it's plagiarism, yes, but it's so much more nuanced than that, because you're asking a question, you're getting an answer. There's nothing wrong with getting an answer to a question you have, but the fact that you can't vet the answer, or that you don't vet the answer, is the real problem, right? The problem with plagiarism is really based on this idea that you're you're not in sort of internally processing the information. You're simply getting something and passing it off as your own, right? And when we think about this with students, when we talk about this with students, what we want to do is we want to have the conversations with them about how did you, what did you tell me? How did you know that it was true? What do you take away from this? And I think while it's harder to identify plagiarism, it's also, I think, when it comes down to being punitive about it, I think what you're doing is you're simply getting kids to be better at hiding it. And what we want to avoid is getting it to a place where students feel that as long as they can't see that I've used GPT, I'm fine. And so, to be honest, I want them to make the personally, if they're going to do it, which they're adolescents, it's going to happen. I want it to be the most obvious I want them to make the dumbest mistake possible so that we can have that conversation to be like, yeah, let's talk about why this was a bad choice. Let's talk about what you didn't get out of this. So I don't necessarily I don't desperately want to make sure that it never happens. I just want to be set up so that when it does happen, like any 13-year-old's going to do something like that, it's got to be built around a conversation around, when you took that information from GPT, how do you know it was true? How do you know, did you vet it? Did you verify it? Did you, or are you simply saying this, this is mine? And that's a different conversation, I think, because it's more complicated than just even plagiarism in the past. If I'm stealing a piece of writing from a book, well, somebody vetted that book at some point. And now if I'm stealing something from GPT, it could be completely, it could be algorithmically put together in a completely wrong way. So I'm not only using not my own ideas, I'm using ideas that are nonsensical. So I think there's a lot of nuance to it that can't be dealt with by simply telling a kid, well, sorry, you get a 0 on this now. It has to be a conversation based on that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I know it's complicated. Yeah.
It is. So there's so many layers, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Speaking of layers, I'm going to kind of set the scene, right?
Mm-hmm.
So let's say this is my high school student and they are involved in so many different programs. They're in sports and honor societies. And by the time they get home, it's 10 o'clock and they have homework to do the next day. How can parents know when to step in and allow it? Like, I think there might be instances where a parent who's tech savvy and uses AI to their benefit in the workplace might say, just put that in chat,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
get a head start on this so that you're
Mm-hmm.
not up all night doing this project. So how can parents kind of walk that line of knowing when to step in and allow it, or when to not allow it at all when their child is doing homework or completing an assignment of some sort?
Mm-hmm. Yes, the place that question comes from hits me right in the center here, because there's so many systemic underlying pieces to what you just said about the idea of a kid feeling like I've got 8 million things and I've got 6 hours of homework, and like systematically and systemically, I will speak as a member of the education world. There's a lot of work that schools have to do to make that not be a viable option, frankly. Like idea, what you just said is a completely normal response to being overworked, overscheduled, overassigned, over homeworked, over all those things that we talk about, result in that. I've always said that, kids don't cheat or commit plagiarism because they're bad people. It's because they need to respond to their situation, and it's oftentimes a very rational response to where they are. And so I think first and foremost, I would say if I'm a parent and you're in that situation, I feel sorry that that's the case, because that's, speaking of when you asked me the question about Bennett, that's something we would, if our kids were feeling that way, we would re-examine our program, frankly, because that's our program is designed to avoid that exact moment, is to be not be in a position where that is something that becomes a viable option. And so I would say though that if that were a case where, if that was a student that was at some school where that was happening, I would say to the parent, if you're having a conversation with them about how to manage that, how to use it, and how to think about it in terms of what they read, what they learned, and not simply as a cure-all, that's a different piece than simply saying, I'll just put it in there, who cares, just turn it in, do what you got to do, and then never talk about it again. It's I think much like any choice a kid has to make, there needs to be a conversation about why I'm doing this and why it might be the most prudent thing for me to work on. So let's say it is an assignment. You can say, yeah, you need to read about this, grab a little chat GPT, but then build off of it. Then tell me, come back to it. Think about what you need to do. And maybe you just need to meet tomorrow's deadline, but then you need to come back to it after the fact, and we'll talk about how to make sure that this is working. I think that's kind of where I would go in sort of a more traditional systematic way, I guess. What I would say is, as a school though, like one of the things that we sort of focus in on is that because once again, the competency-based side of things, we never want to be in a situation where a student feels they have to do something for tomorrow, like, because that might turn into that type of thing. It's like, yeah, this is due tomorrow, but you can then work on it after, like you can get responses and work on it again. So the idea is that the process is more important than the result. And therefore, if you are going to use something like ChatGPT, if you are going to use some sort of AI to do this, use that as a starting point. Let's have a conversation. Let's figure out where to go do next. So I think that's what, if I was a parent of a student in that situation, I would probably say the same thing. Like, okay, let's talk through this, get what we got to get done. We know that this is just sort of the reality, but let's never leave it there. Let's always come back to it and talk about where to go next.
That's good practical advice.
Yeah.
Well, I feel like everything we're talking about right now is only for right now. So I'm wondering, how do you think AI is evolving, and how do you think students' use of it is evolving or will evolve?
I think it's evolving, so incredibly fast that I think the ways in which we will be using it come 3, 5, 7 years from now, like I couldn't even begin to imagine those pieces. I think I think on one hand, you've got the ability for it to do such incredible things. On the other hand, I don't know if you've heard of Gartner's hype cycle. Gartner's hype cycle is a technology term where when something comes out, the belief in it like skyrockets. Oh my gosh, this is going to do this is going to like literally change the world and nothing will ever be the same. And then very shortly after that, people realize, okay, maybe it's not going to do that right now. And then all of a sudden the hype drops off like crazy. And then over time, it starts to build back up because people start to see, oh, I can see how this would work here versus here, as opposed to like, this isn't going to be a cure-all, but it is going to help me in these ways. And I think we're kind of at the moment sort of peaking in that hype cycle a little bit, and we're starting to see a little bit of that drop off, because I think people are starting to realize that, hey, maybe it's not going to revolutionize every single thing, but it's going to be really important. So let's wait and see how that all plays out. So I think where I see it in terms of the impact going forward is I think that in education, I'm hoping that it's going to allow teachers to really reduce the amount of administrative tasks they do in a given day. In other words, I'm hoping that it's something like half the teachers in the country talk about how they spend the bulk of their time doing logistics and not really actually teaching. And so my optimistic take on this is that over the next several years, you'll be able to see it get used in such a way that teachers will be able to spend their time focusing in on the relationship building, the human to human connection that comes with teaching, because I think that's the unreplicatable part of this. And so that's my kind of optimistic side, is that a lot of the things that teachers have to do that we have to spend 2 to 4 hours a day doing that are just like catching up with stuff can kind of be reduced. That's what I would say. And I would say um, the the less optimistic side would be a little bit more that, it's people come to rely on it in lieu of education. They start to say, oh, well, I can just go on if I can get it on GPT, why do I need to know this? Why do I need to do this?
Mm-hmm.
Why do I can just go on, or I can just, I can just recreate, this painting. So why does that painting matter? All of these things that I think could make people less curious, less creative, less learning ready, could be the case. And I'm kind of hoping that my hope is that if we get in front of it like this, we will avoid a situation where it makes people less connected to one another. Because I think
Yeah.
that's both, I think, the most important thing in society, but also one of the most important parts about school is that it's a place that forces you to have to learn how to be a person around other people. And I think that's, if I'm just spending all my time using the newest AI to like literally recreate episodes of The Office from scratch because it can, like that's going to keep me from making connections with other human beings. And I think, that's, I think we're kind of at that, not yet quite, but I think we will be at a moment where we have to make that choice societally between, is this going to connect us more or is this going to drive us more apart? And I'm hoping that schools can be the drivers of what brings us together. And that's what I've always felt about schools, but I think now it's even more important to be the place that forces us as human beings to come together and be people and learn how to be people and be a community, because that's what we take with us from school, possibly over everything we learn is how to be part of a whole. And I think that's important.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
stakes are high. And
Yeah.
I think so. It's really interesting that you went into like how schools are helping build students up to that point. And I think it's really important to call out like the human factor,
Mm-hmm.
ingenuity, empathy, critical thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Those are all the things that differentiate us from AI.
Mm-hmm.
So you kind of talked about how the school is going to play a huge role in helping maintain that connection and set students apart from AI. What can parents do? How can parents help their students develop those skills as well?
Yeah, I think so. I think this is where my answer 10 years ago might have been different than my answer now, because I think now I'm much more of a type of person who would say, you know what, it's okay to be the bad guy periodically. It's okay to say, you know what, we're not going to, no phones at dinner. No, you're not going to your bedroom with your phone. You're not going to have your laptop with you at all times. And frankly, to go back to your earlier question, you're not going to have this assignment for tomorrow because right now we need to be doing this. And if your teacher wants to call me because you didn't turn it in, we're going to do that. But I'm going to tell them that this is what was important to our family today. And I think as a parent, it's easy to get intimidated by this stuff. It goes so much faster than we can keep up, and the older we get, the faster it seems like it goes. And I think one of the things that's important is that the way I like to think about it is, sure, as a parent, you're never going to know enough about technology, but no one in the world is going to know more about your kid than you. So you need to take that and be that expert and say, yeah, I may not know AI, but I know my kid and I don't care what AI does. I want my kid to be learning this way right now. Or I want my kid to have this connection right now. And so it's really important as a parent, I feel like, to set the tone around how we interact as a family, how we interact as a community, how we process things that happen to us, how we do it face to face, how we do it when I can see your facial expressions. I can see the way you're reacting to things. I can see how what I'm saying is affecting you because of the nonverbal responses you're giving me. And really, even if you have to be the bad guy and live with that for a while, it's going to pay off so much more. Because I will say, as a school that banned phones 6 years ago, our kids do not come to us every day and complain about it. Our kids adapted to it, and they now will tell you, even if well, they'll tell you if I'm not around, that they prefer it, that they like being able to have this chance to not be inundated with technology. And I think that's really important, because they're not going to, as a parent, I would say, your kid's not going to, they're going to tell you how much they hate the fact that they can't have their phone. But they appreciate it. They do appreciate it, and they don't know that they appreciate it. And it's like, I think about it like, if it was my kid, and it's like this, if I was on a mountain and there was an avalanche and I'm standing next to my kid, as the rocks are tumbling down, the first thing I would do was put my body in front of the avalanche, right? As a parent, that's what I do. That's what you're doing in some ways. The technology is an avalanche of information and connections, and in some cases just flat out hate and rudeness. And sometimes your job as a parent is to put your body in front of that. And I think that would be my biggest piece of advice to parents is set a tone. Go ahead and tell them how important it is that you get to see their face, because they'll remember that, even if in the moment they don't act like it.
I feel so empowered.
I
Thank you, Martin.
I know.
This is great. I'm inspired
Oh.
and more knowledgeable.
Thanks. We're all just trying here. We're all, this stuff goes so fast that we're all just doing the best we can. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. We're so glad that you were here today, and we have a lot to think about now. This conversation has really sparked something in me. So thank you.
No, thank you for having me. It was enjoyable to talk about. Thanks so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Listeners, we really hope that you enjoyed this episode as much as we did. Check out our show notes for a link to learn more about Bennett Day School. And in our show notes, you can also tell us what you'd like to hear about in upcoming episodes. So hit the subscribe button to stay in the loop, and we'll see you around the neighborhood.